What's going on YouTube? It's Nico from Steel City Vintage. In today's video, we're going to be talking about pre-CPCP Cartier. Now, if you've been a collector and enthusiast of Cartier for any time now, you've most likely come across the term pre-CPCP. And you might be wondering to yourself, what does that exactly mean? But before we get into that, I think it would be useful to actually define what CPCP is, so that way we can better understand what exactly came before it. So if you allow me, let's start off with a little history first. The watch industry was going through a crisis that you guys, I'm sure by now, are all well aware of. It was a quartz crisis that wreaked havoc in the 1970s. At the time, brands across the world were trying to figure out how we can best combat and recoup after this radical change. Some theorized it was best to go in that quartz direction and started to produce cheaper watches to try to combat with the Japanese, while others doubled down and said, no, we're going to make high-end mechanical luxury watches. Now, hindsight's 2020, right? But we see now that those that doubled down in terms of leaning into that luxury end of the market are the ones that really kind of made out on top. For example, it's well documented about Beaver's revival of Blancpain and then their subsequent release of the 6 masterpieces, but really even earlier with brands like Vacheron and AP coming out with their QPs. It was a way of standing up and resisting the influx of these quartz watches. They had cornered already the market with regards to lower priced, cheaper products, but there were individuals out there that still wanted a high quality, finely made, artisanal type of product that had a lot of handmade components in there. Now, Cartier was kind of right in the middle. They definitely weren't early to the party. Sure, they released the Louis Cartier collection that we've talked about in previous videos, but all of those watches, for the most part, used ETA e-bauches. They were hardly something that you would argue was fine Swiss watchmaking from a movement or technical standpoint. Finally, in 1998, they started to revert back that image of the musts in the world. And this isn't to put down the tank musts. They certainly had their place, and they were a very important part of Cartier's history. Some would argue really got them through some of those difficult years with their mass sales of a very, very popular and important model, the Tank Louis, in a cheaper format that allowed it to be more accessible to the masses. But somewhere along the way, I think they looked within themselves and, decided that enough was enough. They wanted to then start to transition that Cartier name that used to be so fondly associated with luxury and exclusivity and try to turn things around a little bit. So what did Cartier do? Well, they did pretty much what they do best. They started leaning back into that exclusive luxury model. And in 1998, they started releasing this collection where they would release approximately 3,000 watches per year. And that lasted up until 2008 for a total of 30,000 watches. Now, you might be thinking to yourself, 30,000 watches, that's a lot. And, for the most part, you'd be right, especially if we're comparing it to Cartier of old, pre-1970, that's a lot of watches. But I want you to put it in relative to the time. This was a time where, industry was booming. Watches were being pumped out. I mean, Rolex was making 1 million watches a year at that point. So, in the grand scheme of things, 30,000 watches over a 10-year period, it really didn't end up being that much. It really reverted back to that more exclusive luxury model. Now, the next question becomes, what did these watches have? Okay, they're exclusive, they're not being sold to the masses, and they have a higher price tag. But what really warrants that higher price tag? Well, for one, they got rid of the ETA e-bauche and elected to go in with higher manufacturers, ones that movements really kind of showcase where it is that they wanted to go. These brands included JLC movements, Frederic Piguet movements, and some that were even done by Journe himself. Now, putting the movements aside for a second, there were other similarities that would allow somebody to readily and quickly identify that this indeed was a Collection Privée model. These similarities included dials that were made out of 18 karat gold and decorated by hand. There also was a Paris denotation that was directly below the word Cartier, no longer at the 6 o'clock hour marker, many of which also included a rose motif. So now that we got the CPCP definition, or the characteristics, out of the way, what does pre-CPCP mean? Well, to be honest with you, it's a term that's kind of been coined by collectors and dealers themselves. And really what it's referring to is any watch that was made before 1998, but still has some of the characteristics that came in the collection afterwards. So for example, we have sold here a Cartier Santos Dumont that was in platinum, encased in platinum. You might have seen it. It was one that was sold with a full set, beautiful watch. But if you noticed, it wasn't like many of the Cartiers I've sold before. It had a dial that looked as if it was guilloché. Those watches that have those types of similar characteristics is what people refer to for pre-CPCP watches. The difference of that dial in photographs and videos is honestly kind of subtle. What I can say is handling a watch like that, it is much more apparent. It's vastly different than the watches that came before from an aesthetic standpoint. It's one that's kind of difficult to really capture. It's easy to underexpose, and you're not really getting that detail of the dial in the photographs or videos. But in person, it's much more apparent. And if that's something, an aesthetic that you want, I think that they're fantastic watches, or something that's a little more under the radar than maybe the Louis Cartier collection in terms of decreased production numbers and just a different aesthetic overall. Now, the premium on a watch like that is really going to be personal preference in terms of if you really like that aesthetic or not. The movement in some of those pre-CP watches are ones that you'll find in the extra plate versions of the Tank Louis Cartier collection. But what I can say is, I think that for a long time, that collection in itself was kind of undervalued. Certainly not at when it was retailed, but you know, years after, wasn't something that was really looked hard upon. But I think looking back on it now, we can say it kind of sparked the move of modern Cartier going in the future. They've had a lot of fantastic releases, and although modern watches really aren't personally my thing, you know, you can always appreciate when things are done correctly, and I think for the most part I like the direction that they're going. But being who I am, my heart's always going to be with the old